Hey, Rick, thanks for being on the show today, brother. I greatly appreciate you.
My pleasure. It's any chance that we get to share our message is a win-win for everybody involved.
Absolutely. Now, where are you coming to us from? Where are you at right now?
So right now I live in Nashville. I relocated my family out here in 2008. I wanted to raise my kids in a location where manners weren't an option, and I wanted them raised in the church. And me growing up in the South, I knew this is where I wanted to be, and me being in music and the music business, Nashville was an ideal location. Plus, we don't have any state income tax, so I got to like that.
You know what? Do you happen to be around Franklin?
I do. I live in Nolensville. We attend church in Franklin, actually, a church of the city, but we live in Nolensville. It's 30 minutes south. It's still in Williamson County, number one county for schools. But yeah, Franklin, Brentwood, Nolensville, Cool Springs, that whole area.
I've got a friend of mine who was in the record business and now he has his own nonprofit and does some things there. He's still in Franklin, and he's from my area, Dallas, Texas. We grew up
Okay.
together in Euless, and he has had nothing. He's like, man, you really need to move out here.
It's really great. I was just actually in your area. I was down in Addison last weekend doing a workshop for Linda Septian, who is a amazing vocal coach and performance coach in that area. So yeah, so we get back and forth.
So now let's dig in. Tell me a little bit, like where you grew up, where you were
Sure.
born. Give me some little background.
So I'm 51 years old as we're recording this. I was born in 1967 to a 16-year-old mother and an 18-year-old father. It was a planned pregnancy, believe it or not. My mom says that she wanted to get pregnant with me so that she could get away from her mother, but that's for a whole another podcast episode with her as your guest. But so I had very young parents. I was born May 4th, 1967. My sister was born April 4th, 1968. My brother was born November 29th, 1969. And then my dad went to the Vietnam War. So when he came back, they separated. So I was born in Northern California, lived in Northern California, part-time with my dad, part-time with my grandparents, as my mom ended up dating Paul Anka's drummer at the time, and they relocated to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And soon after that, we were sent out to live with her. That was the whole plan, is she would come out to Alabama, get set up. That's where we would go. By the time we got there, she was already out of the relationship with the guy that she went out there with. So basically, I was raised and grew up in Alabama in the South, primarily with a single mother. Ended up having one stepdad as part of that, and a few uncles, as we called them. But yeah, so that's pretty much where I was born in California, raised in Alabama, went back to California when I was 17, and that's gotten a little bit of trouble. And it was after getting sober that I started growing up. I always tell people I didn't really start growing up till I was in my 20s.
Yeah, it's interesting. My story is very similar in the sense it took me except 41 years.
Okay.
Once I call it was my BS time period.
Yes, and we all have that. It's like I always tell people, I say, I had a couple different bottoms that I had to hit. I had to hit one bottom to get sober and another bottom to realize that I needed to change who I was on the inside, or I would continue to do things, whether I was drinking or not. If you're still an a-hole, you're still an a-hole. If you're still a liar and a cheater and a thief, the only difference is you're not drinking or using. You better fix that. And God had a real interesting way of humbling me. It usually ended up with jail.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the way he uses a lot of people.
That's the way it works for me, and the way it did work for me.
So tell me more about that. How did the alcoholism, how did
Sure.
that come about? I mean, what led into that lifestyle?
Yeah, I think that, I went to 3 different high schools because we moved around so much. So my sophomore year in Alabama, the Christians and the jocks took me in. So I went to church and I played sports. Junior year, same exact situation. It was my senior year when I ended up leaving Alabama to go live with my dad. Now, I had not been in communication with my father from like 7 to 17. It was a long time. My mom, and this is, I don't want to go into too much detail because this is pretty much her story, not mine to share, but there was a reason that she had kept my dad from us. And part of the fear which she shared is she thought that, we would leave her and go live with him. So that's her thing that she dealt with. But when I was 17, I needed to leave Alabama. I needed to go live with my dad. I needed a change of environment. I was starting to get in trouble. And when I moved out to California my senior year, the Stoners is who took me in at that high school. I had a brother. My dad had married a lady with 6 kids. I had a brother. I don't know if you call him stepbrother. Yeah, stepbrother David, who was about a year younger than me. He was super excited to show all his friends his brother from Alabama with the weird accent. And, he hung around with the kids that were smoking pot and drinking. And I really got into that. And then when I was 18, they took me to a strip bar for my 18th birthday, and I was in heaven. One of the gals loved my voice, said, "Hey, would you announce my set, be the DJ?" I said, "Sure, I can easily say what those guys are saying." I did it. They offered me a job at 18 years old. This was 1985. And I'm like, wow, I'm 18 years old. I'm being paid to work around naked women. This is the life. I don't need to go to college. Heck, I quit high school. I didn't even finish high school at that time. I realized I had a job. Why did I need to finish high school? And my dad was like, you don't want to go there. You don't want to be in that situation. And I'd only really known my dad for about a year. I'm like, well, what does he know? By that time I was that 18-year-old kid with all the answers. And I ended up taking that job. And one of the girls, I started dating one of the strippers, and she absolutely broke my heart. That lasted for a few weeks. And someone came and introduced me to cocaine, said, try this. It'll make you feel better. I tried it. It didn't work. So they said, well, what we should do is probably cook it up and to crack rock cocaine. They did. They gave me a hit off a little glass pipe. I took a hit off that pipe, and I chased that high for the next 3.5, almost 4 years. I took myself to places that I can't imagine anyone ever having to go through. It was a very trying time in my life. It was in the 80s, hair bands, living in Hollywood. So I'm DJing at the strip club. Then I decided that I've always had an entrepreneurial mindset. So I'm like, okay, if the guys in the rock bands like the drugs and the girls, why don't I sell them both? So I became a dealer. And it was quite profitable, and I never had to pay for my own stuff. So that means the more that I sold, the more that I smoked. And by the time it was all said and done on April 4th, 1989, I weighed 118 pounds. I had an addiction of about 7 grams a day of cooking rock cocaine. I looked like death worn over. And for whatever reason, John, it was interesting. I walked by and saw a mirror in my house, and I looked back at myself, and I looked like death. And for whatever reason, I saw myself that day, and I started crying, and I got on my knees, and I'm like, God, let me die and not wake up. I was too scared to put a gun to my head. I should have been dead with the amount of drugs that I was doing, but for whatever reason, that wasn't working. And I was just sick and tired of being sick and tired, which is a cliche that's tossed around recovery rooms a lot, but that's really how I felt. And I had found Christ as a teenager, but by no means was I living that Christian life. So I thought, okay, maybe he'll be disappointed enough in me that he'll take me out. And I asked him, let me go to sleep and not wake up. And I woke up the next day and have not had a craving since cocaine since that day. I have not used drugs since that day. I never felt that I had a drinking problem though, because I used to drink so I could drive because I was so high on coke. It's a weird thing. I had to drink so I could drive, but that was kind of the situation that I was in. So I never thought that I had a drinking problem, but I knew that I wanted to get sober. I walked to my dad's house. I left everything behind, all the material possessions, and I went to my dad's house and I knocked on the door. My dad hadn't seen me in a few years, and I showed up and I said, I need help. And he's like, nope. I'm not going to let. And by the way, when I was walking all those miles to his house, playing it over in my head, that wasn't the answer I thought that I was going to get.
Yeah.
But what he said was, he says, I can't trust you. He says, drug addicts can't be trusted. And with your brothers and sisters in the house, we can't have you here. And I said, I need help. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. And my stepbrother had been in some trouble. So I had been around some recovery programs trying to help him. I said, look, I'll go to AA. I'll do whatever it takes. And that's what I started doing. I went and I got sober and I started attending meetings, started working with a sponsor. 6 months later, I ended up on the radio. I got my dream job. I'd always wanted to be on the radio. I got my GED. I finished school. Everything was going fantastic. Got my first full-time radio gig as an announcer in Santa Barbara, California. My sponsor said, go there and find meetings. There's great recovery. And I got there at 24 years old, sober, on the radio with 2 colleges and a beach town. So I didn't find the meetings. I ended up finding the bars. And my first night drinking, I ended up getting a DUI, which once again was pretty interesting because where I got pulled over was right in front of what's called the Alano Club where they host AA meetings. So I found the Alano Club. I just found it the wrong way. Chalked that up to bad luck. Ended up getting another DUI and then another. I got 3 DUIs in 1 month. The town is so small in Santa Barbara, the same cop who gave me my first one gave me my third one. And that's when I said, okay, this is God trying to tell me something. So I had to turn myself into jail to do 17 days on that particular offense. And on March 17th, which happens to be St. Patty's Day, one of the biggest drinking holidays in the world, 1992, that's my sober birthday. So as of now, I have been sober for over half my life. And it still didn't get any better, and we can talk more about that, but I want to give you a chance to chime in here and ask any questions. But I wasn't done being tested by the Lord yet. I wasn't done getting humble, and that came in sobriety.
You know, and I love the story, dude, because I think so many people, it's in addiction. A lot of people don't understand addiction, right? It's especially those people that haven't been an addict.
Sure.
They don't get it that, oh, can't you just snap out of it? What's the big deal? Just make a decision and move on. You know, and it's not nearly that easy. I mean, I struggled with alcohol for many, many years, for 30 years. And it's like, I know enough to know that I still have to be on guard. I still have to be careful because of, you know, I could screw up again, one little mistake.
Sure.
That's all it would take. And I'd be back in the bars, drunk by myself, messing up my family, screwing up my life. And it's just one of those things where you said it, it's that season of life. It's the prodigal son story more than just once, right?
Right. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. And what people tend to not understand, and if you're dealing with someone in your family who has addiction, a lot of the reasons why I share my story is I tell people your past doesn't define your future if you don't want it to. It's like, how could I go from living homeless on the streets, strung out on crack cocaine, to launching one of the biggest music superstars in the world? And we'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. But it was one of those things where I didn't realize I had a problem. I thought that drugs and the alcohol were the problem. But what happened is after I got sober, I kept getting in trouble. So obviously that wasn't the problem. See, I always thought that I was a pretty smart guy. I said, okay, here's the deal. If I'm not drinking and using drugs anymore, I definitely can drive, even if I have a suspended driver's license, because I only got pulled over when I was drinking. So I validated this story in my head, and I got pulled over for a taillight that was out. So I violated probation by driving on a suspended license. They put the little ankle monitor on me for 30 days. I'm like, okay, no big deal. Then I said, okay, why don't I switch to a motorcycle? I never see motorcycles getting pulled over. So I switched to a motorcycle and got pulled over on the motorcycle and violated my probation a second time. And they put me back on the ankle bracelet. And did another 30 days having to do this. So I was like, I guess I felt that I was just better than everyone else and that the rules didn't apply to me. So after I got pulled over a third time, driving on a suspended license, I found a judge that didn't feel as confident about me as I felt about me and said, look, he says, you just don't understand. The law is the law and no one's better than the law. And he sentenced me to 11 months in jail for violating my probation. And I'm like, okay, there's no way I'm getting out of this one. So they gave me a date for me to turn myself into jail. Now, don't laugh, but my on-air name, my radio name was Ricky Suave. It wasn't my real name, Rick Barker. So not many people knew that Richard Barker and Ricky Suave were the same guy. So when it came time to turn myself in, I chose not to do so. So a warrant was issued for me. I went down to San Diego, thought that I would get a job there, had a guy run a background test, said, dude, you know there's a warrant out for your arrest in Santa Barbara. I said, yeah, but He goes, we can't hire you with a warrant out for your arrest. So I went back to Santa Barbara. And for 3 months, I was on the radio every single day with a warrant out for my arrest. It was paranoia, driving around, looking in the rear view, always knowing that if the lights ever came on, I was gone. You know, there was no getting out of it this time. So in Santa Barbara, it's the sheriff's department that issues the warrants, not the police department. So I'm playing in charity basketball games with the police department, the fire department, my buddy who's a cop showing up at the station a couple times a week. We're having coffee. So one day he happens to be there in the morning at 6:30 in the morning. This is October of 1995. And all of a sudden I hear a walkie-talkie down the hall, and I look over and it's not his. And I just get this sinking feeling in my stomach. And one of the sheriffs walked in, someone that I did know. And he said he had seen the warrant list that day. And it's like, he's like, why haven't you guys picked up this guy? They're like, we don't know where to find him. And he turns on the radio and he goes, he's there every morning. He says, let me handle it. He comes in. So I was arrested on the air. It made the television news. I was the #1 DJ in Santa Barbara, made the news, made the newspaper. The first couple days in jail, after I was done blaming everyone else and realized that I had put myself in there, is when my life really changed. I started attending AA meetings inside the jail. I knew I wasn't getting out for a little while. I met my sponsor in the jail, and in January, I was eligible for work furlough, where I could leave during the day, but I had to turn myself back into the jail every night to stay at the jail. But I had to have a job, and they wouldn't let me have a job as a radio announcer, and that's what my craft was. So one of the most humbling experiences, John, that's ever happened to me is one of my old bosses reached out and he says, what can I do? I said, David, I said, I need a job. His name's David Perry. He's a very special person to me. He said, Rick, he says, I don't have one, but I'll create one. So I went from being the #1 DJ to actually answering the phones and making phone calls for the DJs who were #2 and #3. They are the ones who had replaced me when I left that station to launch this. It was the most humbling job. I had a friend drop a bicycle off at the jail, so I rode a bike down to work. I would get there. I would answer phones. I rode the bike back up the hill to turn myself in every day. And in February, I was eligible for sheriff's parole because I had done well. There was a crowding issue. They wanted to release some stuff. I wasn't a threat to them, and they allowed me the opportunity to register and try to qualify for sheriff's parole. It ended up happening, so I was released February. And the first call I made was to my AA sponsor. I said, Rodney, I said, you know, everybody thought I'd be calling a girl. You know, you've been in jail for 4 months, you're calling a girl. No, I called my sponsor. He invited me to his home for a home-cooked meal with his wife and his 2 daughters. And he had reached out. He said, hey, you played soccer growing up, right? I said, yeah. He says, well, Lindsay's team needs a coach. They've run off 3 coaches. They're in last place. It's only 3 games. He said they call themselves the Miss Americas. That's what they think about themselves. They were 12 and 13-year-old little girls. And what they didn't realize is that I needed the Miss Americas to build my own self-esteem as much as the Miss Americas needed Rick. What I did not realize was that this was God preparing me for something much bigger. So as I get with the Miss Americas, we clicked for whatever reason. We went from last place to 3rd place, ended up making the tournament. We spent all summer together. And then I was invited to coach a girls' high school soccer team who'd never had a winning season. I took the job. We had a winning season the first year. I learned, I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but I speak teenage female. I learned the difference between a 13 and an 18-year-old female is about 20 years. It's not 5 years. There is no middle ground with girls. It's either the lowest of the lows, the highest of the highs. And what that was God preparing me for Taylor Swift, because there was going to be a time when I was going to get the opportunity to work with Taylor and help set the foundation that would go on and end up changing millions of people's lives by having the ability to help mold her early on in her career and work with her